Good day folks, this is Chris checking in for TradeTaxPlus. This is the second technical video in this series of videos, and it deals with the issue of disputed invoices. And it happens every day in business. You and I receive an invoice, we see 1 million. Well, I actually thought this was going to be 100,000. So now the invoice says 1 million and there's 150,000 Rand VAT on this. The question is that we need to deal with is, how do I deal with that invoice which I receive? Now, a lot of people will tell you, well, you can't claim the inputs because it's not the input tax because it's not a valid tax invoice, and that is a lot of rubbish. That's not what the VAT Act says. The VAT Act says that the person that supplies, that issues the invoice, the information on that invoice is regarded as correct in terms of the issuing of that invoice. So when that invoice is issued, the R1 million is accepted as correct. Then the VAT Act says, but it could be incorrect. So there needs to be a mechanism to correct this. And what is that mechanism? Now that mechanism is contained in section 21 and then specifically in section 21 subsection 6. Now what this says is, if I receive an invoice and there's an error on that invoice as envisaged in section 21. Now section 21 lists 5 instances, so if you fall into one of those instances, then a credit note needs to be issued or an adjustment needs to be made. What section 21.6 then says is, if you fall into one of those categories, you may only claim input tax to the extent that it would be the correct amount. So what it really says is you get a full input tax deduction, but then the adjustment that you make is the difference between, it talks about the excess, that's the word it uses, but the excess is then reversed. And you must reverse that as a separate VAT adjustment. Now that is a very important distinction between simply saying you can't claim an input tax deduction. And let me show you why that's so important. If I issue an invoice to you for 10 million Rand plus a whole lot of VAT on top of that, I must account for the output tax. Given, that's a given. I've got it, and you're entitled to the input tax deduction. The fact that we are in dispute about the amount does not change the fact that the tax invoice is a valid tax event. So you still have to account for your output tax, I still have to account for my output tax, and you're still entitled to your input tax deduction. Then we go and say, but what is the nature of this dispute? And it may turn out that we've got a contract saying 1 million, and you say, but I never saw that 1 million beforehand. It was just, or whatever the number is, it was just a typo. And then you start going to court, and you have interactions and all sorts of things that will ultimately result in this being resolved in dispute. Once the dispute is resolved, then we go back into section 21.6 that says, if there was an error, now the error has been determined that there is actually an error in the document, then in the tax invoice, then I must reduce the input I've claimed previously. So all sounds very simplistic. Why don't we just not in the beginning claim all the input tax? Let's think about that for a moment. If I have not claimed my input tax deduction, and remember, I'm not going to pay you. That's not going to happen. I'm not going to pay you the 10 million, whatever the number is. I'm going to pay you what I thought we have agreed upon. So now I don't pay you the rest. Now section 22 kicks in and says, if you haven't paid me in a year's time, you must reverse that output tax, the input tax. But if you subsequently pay me, you can claim the input tax deduction. Now that subsequent payment is not linked to the 5-year rule. So that initial tax invoice that was issued, tick tock, you start seeing the 5-year rule coming into play. You stop that 5-year rule by claiming the input tax deduction. And then only once you've resolved the uncertainty and it becomes a clear error which is now resolved, would you pay the balance and get your adjustment in terms of having reversed the input tax after a year. Let's take my 10 million example. If you decide up front, I'm only going to pay or claim that on 1 million Rand, because that's the correct amount, and this is what section 21.6 says, and by the way, it's not what 21.6 says, but that's the assumption very often. Then after 5 years, now tick tock, the 5-year rule is running. After 5 years, we get to a point where we now resolve, but I actually need, it is actually 10 million, and I pay you the 10 million, I'll claim my input tax then. Sorry, you can't. You forfeited the right to claim it. Because the only adjustment you can do at that point in time would be in terms of a reversal of not having paid, a Section 22 reversal of not having paid my creditor. And then you're stuffed. That's as simple as that. Then you've completely lost the input tax deduction. So the protection mechanism in the VAT Act, in disputes of this nature, that protection mechanism sits in Section 22 of the VAT Act. It says you reverse if you haven't paid, but that reversal is not subject to the 5-year rule if you subsequently pay it. So when I do subsequently pay it, even if it's 20 years' time, I get the adjustment, the 22 adjustment at that point in time. So this is very important to understand. In practice, we've seen many of these disputes where the tariff is dispute or whatever else is dispute, and the disputes take forever to resolve. And we often see that input tax is not being claimed on the basis that there's a dispute going on. That is an absolute disaster. If that 5-year rule passes, 5-year period passes from the time the invoice was issued, you've lost that input forever, irrespective of whether you will be required to make that payment. So hopefully that gives you some idea about what you should be considering when you're looking at disputed tax invoices, and also the nature of a tax invoice and who's responsible, or what information do you look at on a tax invoice from the perspective of the supplier, not from the perspective of the recipient. Okay, so that's enough of this. The last video will deal with leasehold improvements, a quick video on that. Hopefully you'll find some benefit from that. Hopefully you have found some benefit from this video. But for now, it's me, Chris Teron, checking out for TradeTaxPlus, Center of Excellence.